let's put automation in to prevent that in the future, because every gate you put in slows you down. And every time you slow down your ability to iterate, you make your product worse for customers.
Requirements is literally the output of game of telephone. There's a bunch of people ahead of time that came up with those requirements. There's a bunch of people between the actual user and you. So the perfect solution that you ever come to the requirements, I guarantee you, is not the perfect solution.
To kick things off, I should look at the exact time.
It was like 2011-ish, somewhere in there.
Middle of 2011, we started Pelotech actually as amusingly quick release software back in those days. And then we changed our name to Lyft with 3 Fs. And then we got tired of being confused with the car company, which came after we existed, but that, doesn't really matter. So then we changed our name to Pelotech, and we've been that ever since. When we started, our real goal was to take a lot of the lessons we'd learned on rapidly building software in the startup space and help larger organizations adopt those same tools, techniques, tactics for quick customer discovery and quick turnaround release cycles. The idea being that if you learn from your customers and you experiment and deliver value quickly, you can hone in on a tighter product offering. And over the years, we've shifted what we do a little bit. But one of the really interesting things is a key core value of a lot of the technology we invest in today is around accelerating software development teams and accelerating their ability to deliver value to customers so that businesses get that ROI real fast. When we started, we were the lean startup guys in town, and lean startup's great. It's a great process. But one of the things we really felt like we ran into with lean startup's MVP process is it was putting more bullets in our gun in terms of we were able to release more software faster, but we felt like we were still shooting in the dark, right? We didn't know what direction to aim. We were kind of prototyping things a little bit randomly. And I think one of the key things we learned over the years is that you really have to start with an understanding of customers, start with an understanding of needs. Like, it's really hard to build a business from a cool idea you had in the shower and really build like a viable business versus deeply understanding your customers' needs, deeply understanding what your customer is willing to pay for.
There's definitely a lot that happens in 14 years. I think generally speaking, I joined a little bit like later and it kind of looked a little bit different. And then Kav and I kind of said like, hey, do we start a new thing just together, or do we just kind of use this and just take what exists and kind of reimagine in the same way? At the same time, even the reimagining it still had, a lot of the how do we iterate faster? How do we reduce risk? How do you learn and solve problems intelligently about it is all the core dynamics that came in. So when I joined, it was a lot of like, how do you learn how to solve the right problems? Not how do you just build stuff that no one uses? So that I think has been like core to the DNA nonstop. So even when we're not particularly building client facing things, we're helping our clients either shore up their infrastructure or their development process or everything. It's still always with an eye of building the right thing that's useful ultimately for the business. So it might be saying, hey, we're accelerating developers, but it's because it adds more value for what the business is doing. It also ties strongly that like every time that we talk to folks that are clients, the folks we work with, when we're in a spot where it's time to leave or something like that, it's a very, very common thing that they are like, wait, you guys aren't full-time employees? You're not part of the company? You care about this stuff more than we do. Usually when you have like professional services, consultants or whatever, they usually kind of think more about like the piece that they got brought in. And our vibe is much more, how does our piece really connect to everything else so that we can adjust and suggest what is the valuable thing to work on. So even a lot of the history from being able to say, what is the customer discovery and what is the actual customer problem, it just bleeds through the DNA of the whole group, like in general.
Joachim joined the team from cold LinkedIn outreach. So he was friends with some people we knew who were really cool people. I guess we were friends with his cool friends on LinkedIn, and we hit him up and we're like, hey man, we're creating this thing. We'd love to talk to you about it. And he was like, I'm not looking for a job. I got an amazing job right now. I've got an equity package. Like I'm not going anywhere, but sure, I'll meet you for a drink. And 3 months later, he was on the team. So
Yeah.
Joachim's always sort of believed in the vision of what we're trying to do, which is really like that using technology to solve business value problems. Like it's very easy in organizations to put technology in the technology lane and say, oh yeah, the technologists follow the direction of the product management team or the business operations team or whatever. And the reality is there are so many opportunities to use technology to grow your business. And if you're just putting technology folks in the tech lane, you're missing out on a lot of opportunity.
That shows up even when we're working with cost centers within an organization. Oftentimes I'm like, hey, you're a cost center, but you should still operate in terms of how you're generating value within the organization. If you start switching that mentality of not how do we reduce just costs, because cost centers usually don't have any revenue generating piece of it. If you say, how do we switch around the activities that we're doing in a way that helps generate revenue, how you set up everything starts shifting it, and budget conversations start being different because it's no longer how do you do the same with less. It's more like, wait, how can you do more? Well, we need more of this. And a
Yeah,
lot of
and you
that
see
just
that
shows up all the time.
you see this a lot in like the security or compliance departments where it's very easy to treat your job as a cost center and say, how do we achieve required compliance at the absolute lowest cost? And that's fine. Hopefully, it's not going to hurt your business. But a better way to look at that job is how can we deliver business value rapidly and maintain security and maintain
Yeah.
compliance? And what you see with organizations that adopt that perspective is a focus on rapid turnaround, rapid iteration. How do we say yes to what the business is trying to achieve instead of how do we say no, right? It's very easy for a security or compliance organization or an IT organization that's trying to minimize costs and just do nothing, right? If we
Yeah.
do nothing, if the product does nothing, if nothing changes, everything's, like I'm costing very little money. But that's not where the unlocks happen in a business. And one of the
Yeah.
real cool things we see that happens is if you can improve on one of these axes by like an order of magnitude, you can materially change how the business is able to innovate. Like you can change how strategy works at a company if you can move their release frequency up an order of magnitude, right?
Even double down on that a little bit. You can think of AWS as a great example of something that came out of a cost center and then ultimately became an insane revenue generator. I'm not saying that everything is that way, of course, because it's not, but I think that mentality comes across pretty well that cost centers or pieces of organizations in general that don't think about things this way, they tend to become bureaucracies where the value is actually moving paper around, not actually delivering value. And it's very easy for those kind of organizations and groups to just think, oh, my moving this paper from here to here is actually valuable. And you're like, is it really? Because I'm pretty sure if that didn't exist, it would be totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, I would say it's not just cost center teams that have this problem, right? A great example of this in the Amazon story is adding you might also like to the shopping cart. The folks in charge of the shopping cart team didn't really want to add the you might also like because every time you add a step to the checkout process, it increases cart abandonment, right? It lowers revenue because fewer people check out. And one of the things Amazon could have done is say, hey, we can't add an extra step. It's going to increase cart abandonment. We don't want to do that. What they did instead was like, hey, let's try it out. Let's see, like on a certain scale of users, on a certain scale of carts, let's introduce this feature and see what happens. And what they saw is, yeah, sure, maybe cart abandonment went up a little bit, but overall cart size went up through the roof, right? Because the you might also like items people were often buying, customers loved it. And so it was a great shift in terms of driving total revenue. And it's just very easy inside of an organization not to take that larger strategic position. Another classic Amazon story is Amazon Marketplace and Marketplace cannibalizing core Amazon direct sales revenue. And folks who were responsible for that direct sales revenue being pretty frustrated with Marketplace messing up what they were trying to do and trying to limit the product or shift the product or whatnot. And a big part of that story, and it's all secondhand. I didn't work there during this period or anything, but a big part of what I heard from that story was they had to have a little bit of a come to Jesus conversation about how marketplace revenue has zero cost to Amazon. So they're very happy for third parties to be selling through their platform. If it cannibalizes their first party revenue and they get a lower margin on those products, like, sure, but the ability to scale to everyone is massive, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a perfect solution to all of it. Like we all have different deficiencies, all have blind spots and things that come into play. But it's so common for especially early on in your career as engineers to be like, "Oh, you have this idea of what the perfect solution is." That you're like, "I'm going to be spending time doing this perfect thing because technically, according to these requirements that was given, this is the perfect solution." While missing the fact that like the great example is, as kids playing the telephone game of being like, hey, say a word to one person, or you're like, requirements is literally the output of game of telephone. Like that's what that is. There's a bunch of people ahead of time that like came up with those requirements. There's a bunch of people between the actual user and you. So all of those things has been entirely a game of telephone that happens. So the perfect solution that you ever come to the requirements, I guarantee you is not the perfect solution because it's already flawed in concept. There's already noise added to the whole scenario. So the actual perfect solution is, I mean, probably just doesn't exist, but it's a combination of multiple vectors of what can the business afford, what's the culture, what antibodies exist in the organizations that want you to fail, not purposely because they want the business to fail, but because, people are people and they're going to do humany things that is sometimes counter to what's most beneficial for them. And you have to take all those things in consideration for what's the perfect. And in my view, perfect is more heading towards a better world, not trying to build the ideal version or the ideal world. Frankly, because I don't think I'm imaginative enough to think of what's perfect. I think if you continuously get better, you sometimes get to a place that is actually better than you could have imagined. You're like, wow, this is meaningfully better than what I would have imagined at the start. But by being able to adapt and do small experiments and talk to people, see what they like, somebody comes up with a whole new idea, like increasing something that's complete, like everybody said, adding more steps to checkout would make it slow down. But inadvertently, it's like, oh my gosh, no, it's actually in some scenarios, it's not. There's a lot of things like that that I think are really important. But for engineers, especially, I think that that's one. Even within our team, we have a lot of conversations about that of saying, hey, like, I know that you want the perfect solution. And part of that also within our group is folks will be like, but we want to do the best thing for the client, right? Like it's this thing. I don't know if this is the best thing for the client. Like I really want to do the best thing for the client. And that desire sometimes is you have to still take a step up and say like, yes, I know you want the best thing for the client, but the best thing for the client a lot of times has a lot of vectors. There's a lot of vectors that are inputting to that. And so what you're looking at is one vector, and you need to expand as much as possible, as many vectors as you can possibly grasp and work collectively on to really head towards a direction. So
This is a huge growth area for a lot of engineers at a lot of companies. If I had any advice for folks who feel a little stuck in their software development career, it's stop learning new technologies and start learning about the rest of the business. It's a little bit of a what got you here won't get you there, but it's one of those things where early in your career, learning new technology, learning new languages is critically important. As you get more skilled, there comes a point where as you learn new things, they kind of fold into your understanding of existing things. And yeah, there are truly novel technologies. LLMs are weird and different in a way that like very few things in our careers have been. But a lot of times you can kind of fold new things. You can classify them according to the things you already know and get a rough understanding. But understanding why the business is asking you to do things can transform your career. I mean, a great example of this is it's not an infrequent thing to see happen where a software development team will be tasked with building something where if they pop up a level, have the right conversations, they can make a buy decision instead of a build decision and save the company a boatload of money and long-term maintenance and just improve the story overall, right?
yeah. And I don't think that I could probably like state what Kav just said enough. If I was to think of like in my career, like what's helped me the most in software, it's not actually software. It's the fact that I worked in manufacturing. It's the fact that I taught dancing for a while and danced all over the world. It's the fact that I've traveled all over the world and got to meet a bunch of different humans that act different ways and started being like, oh, okay, like, yeah, people have very different views. And like, how do you operate within that? It's the fact that like all these various experiences I've had working in finance or working in energy stock trading or working in like medical fields or like all those different experiences, you start seeing common patterns and especially how people relate, how they work, how do you solve problems, how miscommunication happens. That miscommunication ends up being core to so many issues in organizations that oftentimes people, I mean, there are people that are intentionally kind of, assholes in general, but like for the most part, it's a lot of just misunderstandings, misalignments of incentives that are missing. So the more you experience that, I think the better, especially once you get to like senior role and you have a lot of the technical stuff dialed in, the technical problems aren't the hard problems. It's everything else.
There are often, there are often knowledge gaps and there are often process gaps. Like culture, culture with a big C can be a big one. I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of the clients we work with have is not understanding that you're not going to get it right. Like a classic story I love to reference is the 50 pot story from the book Art and Fear. It's a fantastic story, but basically the premise is this pottery teacher tells half their class, hey, I'm only going to grade you on one pot, but make the best pot you possibly can. This half of the class, you get an A if you make a perfect pot, a B, down. So make me one perfect pot. And then the teacher tells the other half of the class, I'm not going to grade you on the quality of your work at all. I'm going to grade you on the quantity. I don't really care if your pots are cool or good or great or whatever. I want you to learn the fundamentals from me. And then I want you to make as many pots as you can. I'm just going to count them up. And whoever makes the most gets an A. And then it goes on down from there. And the end of the story is sort of what group made the better pot. And what you see in organizations all day, every day, as much as you know where this story is going, they're like, we're going to plan the perfect pot. It turns out that's not how the folks who make the best pot are the folks who make 50 pots, who sit there and shape the clay and understand things about it as they work with it. They learn by doing, right? And organizations really struggle with this because they want to put something great in front of their customers. And that's, admirable and understandable. But it's counterintuitive that if you want to put something great in front of your customers, you have to iterate. It's the first thing you come up with is not going to be the best thing. So how do you get as many at bats as you possibly can? How do you tack toward the awesome experience that you're capable of? And we run into organizations where they're like, well, cool, we like that idea, but like let's just iterate on a piece of paper and then we'll have the perfect pot. And iterating on a piece of paper is what the people who are trying to make a perfect pot are doing. It's not about iterating on a piece of paper. It's about making pots and shipping pots. And of course, when I say that, I mean software. So putting software in users' hands, learning from that experience and iterating on improving. And it's just a huge challenge because so many organizations want to use quality gates and stage gate process and validation and external review. And they add steps and add steps and add steps and add steps. And it just lowers the overall quality, right? Like the fundamental lesson of the Accelerate book, which I would strongly recommend everyone in software read, is that counterintuitively, teams that ship faster and more frequently produce higher quality software, right? It's the same thing as a 50 pot story, but actual research on actual software development teams, lest you think I'm just making up stories, right? I want to say it's 26,000 developers. They're not messing around in terms of how many people they looked at for this. It holds consistently true. But time and time again, we see clients who are like, oh, we shipped a bad release or we made a mistake. Let's put a gate in to prevent that kind of mistake in the future. To some extent, that makes sense. Let's put automation in to prevent that in the future, because every gate you put in slows you down. And every time you slow down your ability to iterate, you make your product worse for customers.
Yeah. And I find it kind of funny because sometimes when you ask a question and it's especially both of us, I'm like, I wonder if Kav will say something like the same thing as I do, like I will or whatever. And I guess we've been around each other enough where I'm just like, yes, ditto. What I was going to say is like just cycle time in general, that like the first thing in organizations that I always see is cycle time is always too long. And I would also venture to say that this isn't a software thing. It's in any part of the organization. Anything in which you have a lot of gates takes too long. Like how you make decisions, how you, like everything is make it smaller, faster, reduce the risk of like making that decision so that you can make more of them instead of trying to remove all risk. When you say I'm going to not have any risk, then you're just going to plan forever. And then the cost of a mistake is really high. Our vibe is way more reduce the cost of mistakes so that you can make mistakes, learn from them, and remove them. But you can make mistakes because the cost of those mistakes is very low. We want to reduce the cost of mistakes, not increase the cost of mistakes. And that's oftentimes people think that like, oh, reduce the cost of mistakes, let's remove mistakes. And that's not what we mean. Trying to remove all mistakes and make sure that there's never any mistake actually increases the cost of the mistake. So there's some interesting paradigms that's that way. Not to bring Amazon in the mix because I really like, there's plenty of things I don't like about it. But one of the interesting things that they have there, you know, that has been thrown around the internet over and over again is the whole thing that when somebody has an idea that like they make more effort to try to shut down the idea than they do for the person to justify their idea. And now kind of depends on the organizations and things like that, because there's plenty of organizations I've been in where I'm like, please don't let folks be able to do whatever they think, because man, that might be really dangerous. But conceptually, I think that there's a lot of value in that kind of piece. Like, and actually I would even say in any organization, even if you had people that had dangerous thoughts, the whole aspect is the reason they can do that is because they're saying you can do the idea, just you can't do it in a destructive way of where if it fails, it blows everything up. It's again, reducing the cost of the mistake. If you say we allow anything to happen, but any of the choices you make has to be validated low risk first, then all of a sudden what's available to you is massive. And you can have people that aren't particularly successful. And now you also get better feedback on who's not successful. If you got somebody that just throws out idea after idea after idea after idea, nothing works, you're like, you didn't have to wait years. You could just like get that feedback right away. If you have folks, and it doesn't mean that like get rid of them. I mean, maybe in some cases, but it can also mean they're maybe better suited in a different type of problem space, and that's where it's better suited. So there's a lot of just really interesting reinforcing behaviors that come out of that principle.
Yeah, one of the great patterns we see in this in organizations that get it is their executive team is asking, how do we allow anyone in the company to put their idea for improving the customer experience, improving the business in front of 10 customers or 100 customers, right? Depending on your scale, obviously these things vary. But how do we allow them to put it in front of 10 and not everyone? Or how do we put it in front of 100 and not everyone so that they can explore these ideas? A lot of folks get nervous about that, though. I mean, it's just very easy to understand. Again, they want that perfect experience. They want every cup of coffee you serve at your coffee shop to be exactly right. And sometimes when you're experimenting, it's not going to be exactly right for a user or two. Somebody's going to get a bad cup of coffee. And you know what? You're going to refund them. You're going to give them another cup of coffee. It's not a big deal, right? I think understanding the good intent and that the team is driving toward delivering more value, and so they make small missteps along the way. Users understand that. Users respect that. Customers understand that. Customers respect that. You're not going to get a bunch of ill will from folks if you're making their life better. Also, the payoff of doing this kind of work leads to an orders of magnitude better product. So you're going to earn goodwill through the successes you have. It's not, a litany of failures here.
And I think that ties actually into an interesting premise that I've seen over and over again. And it's oftentimes like, you obviously don't want to have everything you do be a mistake. Like, it's just not sustainable. But oftentimes how you handle mistakes has a better indication and a better memory footprint into people. The times in which I've flown for an airline or gone to a coffee shop or gone to a restaurant, or even with our clients, the time where we've messed up and we said, look, we're going to be transparent about what happened. Here's what took place. Here's how we're going to make sure it's not going to happen again. We're partners in this. We're going to make sure that you're not left holding the bag. Being able to have these experiments, make sure that it's not detrimental to anything, but we're together fixing it, and we're fixing it in an appropriate manner, builds more trust. So when I'm in a restaurant and there's a mistake and they handle it well and appropriately and with finesse, then I'm like, wow, I don't have to worry about when something gets messed up, that it's not going to get taken care of. Because in life, things get messed up. But I do think that there is a common pattern across a lot of things, whether it be client services, whether it be selling products, whether it be a restaurant, whether it be manufacturing or whatnot, where reducing the mistakes, but when the mistakes happen, being able to know how to handle them effectively so that you build up trust is massively, massively, massively useful. Now, obviously, there may be some exceptions in there. Like, I don't particularly want my airplanes to have like, an experiment around like if it crashes or not. But there's still like subsystems of that operate really well. Or I don't want my radiologist to like be like, hey, sorry, man, you just got a bazillion radio, like whatever.
Yeah. In a new machine,
Impact,
you have
like,
super cancer now.
Yeah, exactly. And it's obviously tied to the actual risk of what the impact is of the negative. So I think that goes back to, you have to measure what is the negative impact of that consequence and be able to make sure that like everything is in line that way.
I think a thing people often don't understand, though, is that world where you're trying to make no mistakes and trying not to screw anything up. And so you go so slow and you iterate so slowly, the customer experience actually ends up being worse. And you actually end up having more mistakes. And one of the cascades that ends up leading to us getting brought into organizations is they're failing on our promise to our customers or our users. We keep adding process to try and get above the water here, and every additional step we add slows us down even more. Like, we're tying weights to ourselves as we're drowning, and it doesn't seem to help. And so they call us in and say like, hey, we're underwater drowning, we're covered in weights, it doesn't matter how much more weight we tie to ourselves, we just keep sinking more, help. And so then we can talk to them about like, hey, the bar is like pretty low right now. You're not delivering on your user promise. You're not delivering on your customer promise. So given that's the case, like, can you open up some of that flexibility? And usually they can, and usually there's a willingness there, but it does take a big shift.
I would also say that even when the thing that ends up being problematic in those areas is that organizations usually want to do more of what they've been doing to try to get themselves out of that situation, not less, because a lot of times those things are the natural, obvious things. So even when we go into organizations, oftentimes I'll think like, maybe that'll work this time. But most of the time I'll be like, okay, let's do a little bit of this and let's do a little bit of that. And which one's better? And then as this works a little bit better, we're like, ooh, let's do more of this. And then slowly it starts shifting off. So I've very rarely gone into an organization and been like, hey, we need to really revamp this. And everybody be like, yeah, let's do all this, because then they're like, what? Chaos is going to ensue. And so oftentimes you do have to take a measured approach depending on the appetite of the organizations, because realistically, and I think even if I said, look, you can go from where you are now and let's tomorrow go to the absolute best, I'm not entirely sure that that's even a good trajectory. I think that the learning that you have to do to get to that spot is what reinforces that in a behavior that continuously improves over time. Whereas if you get there, there's a little bit of like, you can't have your professional trainer exercise for you. You kind of need to follow it a little bit. You need to like run a little bit. You need to kind of like learn those pieces to be able to get there. And that's something where I think that is part of the experience as well. And part of like getting better is the act of doing the incremental phases to get there.
Yeah, well, and you see that a lot. Like when we were doing more process-focused consulting and less delivering the technical bones of this to organizations, and we were really trying to help them shift their process, oftentimes we would start the conversations with their teams about like the principles behind it and what drives them from a principle standpoint. A lot of our clients at the time struggled with that because they were like, no, we just need to know how to do our work differently to get different results. We don't need to know why we're doing our work differently to get different results. And what we found is like, that's not true. You absolutely need to know why you're doing the work differently. If you don't buy off on the idea that rapid iteration delivers higher quality than having a lot of quality gates, you will turn a rapid iteration process into a lot of quality gates. And you see this with a lot of agile implementations. You see a lot of SAFe and things like this that they just take agile and turn it back into something that isn't agile. And so they miss on all the principles, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to say, yeah, sure, we're an agile team, but then you got documentation up the yin yang because you're not the actual Agile manifesto that says working code over comprehensive documentation. Now, is the Agile manifesto saying working code over any documentation? No, not at all. But it's very easy for organizations to get lost in the actions here and not understand that a lot of this comes down to principles. Great book on that, by the way, Toyota Kata, for folks out there. Fantastic book on lean and what lean really means to Toyota. And it's just really funny in that book that the consultant who wrote it, he tells the story of like being a lean consultant for years and constantly going to Toyota and saying like, are we doing this particular procedure that Toyota used to do correctly? And all the Toyota executives looking at him like, well, that's not lean. Lean is the principles behind this.
Yeah.
Like lean isn't how we check that the seatbelts are installed correctly.
Yeah. It's a thing that I run a lot into, especially existing organizations. We've even had scenarios where we're like, we lean more towards continuous delivery and continuous flow and Kanban and as close to possible as mid to delivery to prod and more in that lean side of things, which definitely ties strongly to more of an agile flow. And then I'll talk to folks and they're like, oh, I'm a Scrum whatever. And they're like, oh, we should really switch to Scrum because that's agile. And I'm like, okay, so you're wanting to go from the really small batches that we have right now where you deliver to production in minutes to an hour, and you're wanting to now switch and make it every 2 weeks, which maybe in some scenarios might be the right call, but for that, it was almost from a religious standpoint into Scrum meaning a thing that it does, or big A Agile meaning the way that it does. It's the actions that happen, not the principles that lead to the value and the outcomes that you want. And that I think is like oftentimes a misalignment.
I think a key thing, if you're trying to speed up the delivery of value to your customers, you need to look at the problem holistically. But a lot of times the gap isn't engineering. Like engineering is buried in customer support issues because of how your customer support functions, or engineering is buried in technical debt because they overcommitted to a schedule to meet some marketing deadlines back in the day, or product is trying to decide between several sets of visions and engineering is trying to develop technology that supports those multiple visions, and it's unclear exactly which way the chips will fall. So there's a lot of hedging going on, right? Like there are a lot of reasons your engineering org is maybe not moving in the right direction that don't necessarily have to do with just adding more engineers. I think a challenge, obviously, mythical man months, 9 women can't give birth to a baby in 1 month. There's a lot of that happens in software development where if we just throw more developers at it, the problems will go away. I think one of the big things we try to drive with organizations is helping new developers onboard quickly, new developers be able to deliver value quickly. Because if new developers can onboard quickly and new developers can deliver value to the customer and the user quickly, then you can start saying, okay, how would we roll up this team? Like a common thing we've run into in the past is engineering orgs that aren't executing particularly well, but then the time for a new developer to deliver value to customers will be something like 6 months. And you're like, well, okay, you can throw a bunch of developers at this problem, but it's not gonna, even in the best case, it's not gonna change anything for your users or your customers for 6 months. That's a terrible story. So, well, I think a lot of it is like, you've got to look at the whole system and you've got to say, how can we get the entire organization aligned around the same kind of value, the same kind of moving in the same direction, and charging toward the same goals. And then a lot of those things pay off. I think there's a huge gap in a lot of organizations between stepping from management into leadership. And I don't think organizations do a great job of teaching folks how to make that transition, right? Management is about supporting individuals and making sure each individual is unblocked and can achieve the work that's been assigned to them. It's about parting out that work. It's about growing those people's careers individually. Leadership is about setting a vision for the organization, setting a direction for the organization, so that if you ask any individual, hey, what direction are we going? They can point in that direction. I think a lot of organizations forget how important that is because they don't realize how much every single day each individual at the company makes micro decisions that track toward what direction the company as a whole is going. And without any sort of vision, those micro decisions are just based on hallway conversations or based on what they're, and in the aggregate, those micro decisions can be incredibly powerful in terms of enabling your company to achieve their goals, or incredibly limiting, right? I mean, a big one we've been talking about is, do you add process? Do you slow things down? Or do you recognize speeding things up will actually improve quality? We make it sound like that's a big decision, but the reality is that's a micro decision that people are making every single day. Every time they choose how to solve a quality issue is, hey, should we make the unit test runs run for another 5 minutes, another 10 minutes every time you commit? Or should we find a way to do this that it doesn't interfere with like a core path there? These things crop up all over the place.
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, I think that I tend to lean on, I mean, there's probably 3 categories of data that you could get. And they're not really categories, but they're a little bit of like temporal of like when. There's the one that when you're starting like, oh my gosh, this is data I have to have now. I know for sure. It's kind of like I guess it goes back to there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns. And I think a lot of times folks aggregate all this data for the unknown unknowns. So if you just say, hey, we know that this data is going to be data that we need to get because we're going to use it like right now or in the foreseeable future, that's a no-brainer. If you're like, wow, this kind of data has at least, we have some known unknowns that are going to be coming up later, and this is at least in the shape of that, then you can kind of make a cost, like best guess cost effort of saying like, hey, we're willing to spend a little bit more money because this data falls into the known unknowns category. If you're starting to go into the, I don't know, this data might in some world, in some future, help us, let's just keep it, then that's where I'd probably be like, probably not. If you start having to make up really weird scenarios for it, then, just don't do that. Just like jettison. And worst case, I mean, a lot of times in the space, we're talking about data that for the most part, especially if we're talking about logging metrics or any of that kind of stuff, it's usually data that like, we can just turn it on at some point in time. And then after a month, after a couple months, you have enough data to then make a choice. It just means you can't make the choice that instance, but that's okay. Obviously not with like data that's critical to your users. Like if, for example, you're working in some military or finance or whatever, and you need to start tracking all of the users' behaviors on like logging in, logging out, like obviously that stuff is critical, but that's a no. Like that is critical data that you need to store, you need to have. But the made up scenarios would just be like, don't.
I think another thing I would go to there is a lesson we learned working with Steve Blank years ago, where he said, like, pick up the phone, like just stop collecting data or putting up landing pages. And you're like, oh yeah, we're going to get this super useful information from this one thing. We're going to spend a week building a web page to learn this thing. Just call somebody on the phone and find out what the answer is. Like, so many of the questions people try to use their metrics and their data to answer are fundamentally qualitative questions about the experience of the product, where data isn't really going to tell you how well it's working anyway, because there's no data for how pissed off your users are as they're clicking around on the screen. I mean, you can see where they like squiggle their mouse or like there's like some rage click tracking and stuff. I mean, in general, just get on the phone with people more often and you'll find a lot of the need for some of that data goes away. As Joachim says, there are a lot of times where you do need to collect the data, a lot of caveats there. But I think there are a lot of teams that are trying to put a blanket user satisfaction around themselves by collecting data, when a phone call or two would tell them whether their users are satisfied. How many curse words they use in the emails they send your support team will tell you how satisfied they are. You don't need, user metrics for that. I would say a key metaphor that I use when thinking about LLM adoption is hand tools versus power tools, right? A lot of the LLM techniques and technology allow you to work a lot faster, maybe not with the same level of precision, not with the same level of craftsmanship. And we're sort of defining exactly what that means. But if I handed you a pile of power tools and said, go build me a house, Are you going to successfully build a house? Like, probably not. There are a lot of things to know about building a house that have nothing to do with how quickly you can cut boards, how quickly you can nail stuff together, right? There's a whole set of understanding that sits outside of the expertise of LLMs. And I think it's just very easy to confuse the support you're getting from an LLM with knowing the answers there. And it causes a lot of chaos. And my go-to task for everyone, like my LLMs will really help you here, is translation of things from one format to another. If you're trying to learn about a code base, you're a new developer, you're maybe a little sketchy on the syntax, ask an LLM to explain what the code in the file does, read that explanation, then go back and review the code in the file. It's a great tool for that in terms of helping you understand things. I think having a human in the loop, using it to build your understanding, is going to amplify people over the years. But one of the big things we call out to the more junior developers on our team, and just generally as you're going throughout your career, as a software developer, every time you complete a task, you should have a better understanding of the syntax of the technology you're using, the customer problem you're solving, the business context of the customer problem you're solving. You're accruing expertise, wisdom, etc. If you just throw shit at an LLMs and you aren't becoming a more valuable asset, that's going to screw you in the long term, right? Like, if you're not learning and getting better at your job every time you do something, like, what are you doing? I think that's a huge one to call out.
Yeah. And there's a few things that I would throw in there. One is, like, it's going to continue to improve. It's going to get better, but we don't particularly know exactly where and how and all those things yet. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's been built by pure AI works, but also like the user experience on it is like completely garbage. Or even if you look at some of these CLI tools that are auto-generated for managing the LLMs and everything, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's 20 different config files and none of them are consistent and everything. And I'm like, okay, great. Like, yeah, great example of how AI is going to go. Now, that's a little bit tongue in cheek because I've definitely seen, and there's a few folks I've been talking around, bringing back a heavier set of TDD mindset of being able to say, how do you bring about that kind of style of approach to development, of where it's more of a test-driven development with AI generating the code and whatnot. So I think how your workflow operates is going to evolve, and it's going to become really valuable. At the same time, I would go a little bit further than even just saying, hand tools and power tools. I feel like it's a little bit like, do you give someone that's trying to, like, tear down a house a nuclear bomb? Like, no. Like, nuclear bombs have a very specific use case, and like they're very freaking good at what they do. But like, I don't particularly want to give, I don't want to give just somebody a nuclear bomb that says, okay, cool, like now you can destroy and create this huge mess. And I think that the whole AI space in general and if you combine that also with one other thing, which is a lot of times, I mean, there is the curve of, as you learn something, right? You start out and you don't know the space. So you, all of a sudden you're like, wow, you learn a little bit and you think you know a lot about the space. But then as soon as you start learning more, you're like, whoa, you start understanding, less and less. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know anything. But you actually you've been continuously learning. It's just your perception of where you are is now adjusted to reality. And then you go to the flow of where you're actually getting competence. The unfortunate thing about AI is, as you're developing this, it makes that peak up here last way longer, because you can kind of be here and then you're not actually progressing. You're just kind of flatlining for a bit. And then for a while, you might maybe discover that you're not competent, but all of a sudden you're dropping massively faster than had you actually learned those pieces. And I think if you combine that with like the nuclear bomb spot, you just need to be cautious.
Well, and to give a little timeless AI advice, because I think it's true, all of the things we've talked about apply in an LLM world. All of the things we talk about to make development teams faster, all of the developer experience things that accelerate teams, all of the focusing on how do you produce high quality software at speed apply. How do you keep your cycles short? How do you keep your feedback loops quick? Apply to AI, and probably will continue to apply to AI because they don't have anything to do with how the code is being produced, right? Having strong guardrails on the code that's produced is great. Having that handled by automation is great, right? It helps your developers, it helps your LLMs. So one of the things we've seen is that teams that have good DX practices and have a good developer experience and work in short cycles are able to adopt these tools pretty effectively. And teams that have long cycles and don't have good developer practices and good guardrails are in for a roller coaster ride.
I was hoping that you would go. That way it would give me a second to think about what that is. I think if I was going to say like, hey, what kind of folks that I would imagine being able to be on is probably folks that have experienced like failures, honestly, interesting places or interesting things that didn't work and then how you got out of that. Or folks that definitely have like the focus on like the empathy of, like just people and how that operates. And there's always this interesting aspect of where like we care a lot about the empathy side, but like having the balanced approach to saying like empathy of how it impacts users, employees, organizations, and things like that, while also understanding that at the end of the day, like if you're not making money as an organization, like you're not surviving to be able to achieve those things. I imagine that a lot of the conversations we'll have will end up being both technical and not, because a lot of our conversations that we say is like, what are some really cool, deep technical things that are interesting? But it's also going to be, how does that ultimately impact the business? Like, how are people being impacted by those like cool technical whatever that's coming in play? So I imagine it's like that balance. It's always going to be probably deep technical things and how it can help the business, and then like interesting problems and how business operates and how that actually impacts then the technology groups. So I think it's kind of like in that, probably a little bit like in that between spot of there is what I would imagine.
They read it as move fast and break things. They're trying to, make empathy. They want everyone to feel good about their work. And it's one of the things I think I really want to drive home to folks is like, sure, that stuff is great. And I'm all for, not having a bunch of ridiculous, superfluous rules that actually make things worse. And I'm not for people having a shitty time at work. But at the end of the day, these things are about making a better business and being more successful and delivering better value for your customers and your users. I'm not like kumbaya just because I like everyone to have a good time, although I want everyone to have a good time. It's actually a path to more success.